My name is Peter, and I come from Ireland. To make a long story short, I used to participate in amateur boxing matches, hoping to enter the professional world. But to keep food on my table between fights, I worked for a private security company in my home city of Dublin. I thought it would all be about working doors, like being a bouncer. But it turned out there was much more to private security than removing drunk people from bars. That was a big part of what the job involved. Do not get me wrong, but every now and then, we got a job that was somewhat out of the ordinary. For example, I had to protect a place of worship at one point because some complete idiots were stationed outside, trying to scare the people going in and out. We got hired to protect a nursery once too, if you can believe that, because some crazy person had come around making threats to the kids, and the police could not get hold of him. But without a doubt, the most memorable and most unusual event I was ever asked to provide security for was a funeral. But not just any funeral. It was for the boss of one of Dublin's largest crime families. I am not joking. This was back in 1991, when I was just 23. And by that time, I had gotten used to getting the occasional strange job. But when my boss told me that we were to guard a funeral one Friday morning in September, I could not help but ask him for more details. It was not just me either. Everyone had their questions about it. Then, when our boss filled us in, we could barely believe our ears. I doubt anyone listening to this would recognize the name, but if you were alive in Dublin around then, and I said the Fitzies, then you are definitely going to know who I am talking about. Anyway, Big Fitz had died, as you know, and he was going in the ground that Friday morning. And since the family was quite easily the wildest in all of Ireland, the big man's funeral needed many security guards. I believed it too. A family that crazy and violent with all that alcohol and grief in them. It probably looked like a 5-card Vegas fight night by the time the buffet opened up. At least that was the joke we were all sharing at the time. You just did not know how right we were. We were told we would not be needed at the church service, only at the Fitz family home, since that is where the alcohol would start flowing properly. Then, on the morning of the funeral, we arrived at around 11 o'clock at this big mansion on the outskirts of the city. I had never seen anything like it in the flesh. Only on the television, maybe, but not up close. It was like someone's dream home. All castle on the outside, with modern living on the inside. They even had a maid that showed us around the place before the family got back from the church service, and we had to put on our professional hats to keep the place secure. The first black Range Rovers began turning up outside around 11:30, and out came a steady stream of weeping older women, supported by their sons and nephews. It looked a lot like any other funeral, I suppose. Oh, this one had outfits some people's whole salaries might not be able to cover. There was more Gucci and Prada than an Italian fashion show, and I could not tell which reflected the sun's glare brighter. The fancy leather on their shoes or the fancy watches on their wrists. Do not ever tell me crime does not pay. The mood was very tense at first. As you can imagine, it would be among a family full of violent gangsters, possibly even murderers. But aside from that very large aspect of the job, it was much like any other funeral for the first couple of hours. In fact, one of the hardest jobs I had in those first few hours was refusing all the drinks the Fitz family was offering. They were a wild bunch, but they grieved like any other Irish family, which meant that after all the teary-eyed tributes and hugs among the bereaved, the party started by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Spirits were high, music was thumping inside the house, and me and the lads were starting to wonder what we had been worried about. We pictured some family disagreements descending into mindless violence, but in reality, we were in more danger of getting hit on by drunk women in their 50s than being part of any sort of brawl. We had 4 more hours to keep guard, and these 4 hours seemed like they would be some of the easiest we had ever worked. But then it happened. The home's back garden was massive, and I mean truly massive. There was a big lawn, a football pitch, and tennis courts combo toward one side. Then a big pond and a gazebo on the other. We had 4 fellas surrounding the house, myself included, then 2 inside, which we kept on cycling to give them a break from all the harassment at the hands of the menopausal cougars. I was round the front talking to a fellow guard when we both suddenly hear the lad round the back talking over his radio. Someone had started banging on the backyard fence pretty hard, too. And then the next thing we hear him swear. Before all went quiet, we ran around back of the house to see what the issue was, and then arrived just in time to see a man wearing all black and a balaclava smash his way through the fence using a sledgehammer. He gave the fence one last bash to really open it up, and then in streamed about a dozen identically dressed fellas, all carrying the likes of baseball bats, hammers, and clubs. Aside from the odd knife or pair of brass knuckles we were carrying on the sly, none of us were armed well enough to defend against an attack like that. So instead, we focused on getting everyone inside and securing the home's back doors behind us. But since one of those back doors was a big glass sliding one, you can imagine how well that went for us. The masked men simply smashed their way into the home as we were getting everyone either out the front or upstairs to safety. But that is where the second problem came in, because many of those inside did not realize what was happening until it was too late. All they knew was that someone had turned up looking for a fight, so in their state of drunkenness, they were all well up for a scrap. They just did not realize the attackers were armed until it was too late. But even then, that did not deter many, and what followed was a bloodbath. The men of the Fitz family put up a brave and brief defense, but they were all blind drunk and had nothing but their fists. 1 or 2 of them managed to land a punch or two, one of which knocked an attacker clean out. But anytime that happened, the gang of attackers would swarm, beat the defiant man till he was either screaming or silent. Then they move on to the next. I suppose they did what they had to do in a way, making sure security had the space to evacuate all the women and kids to wait in cars or safe areas upstairs. But it was only a matter of minutes before the gang beat back any resistance and started making their way towards the stairs. At that point, it became a question of how to keep the gang of attackers from advancing up those steps. I was freaking out, thinking there is no way we are going to be able to hold them off. But to my surprise, the Fitz family had already planned for such an event, in that they had stocked their master bedroom with a couple of unconventional but very effective defensive weapons. Big Fitz, before he died, had been quite the collector of martial antiquities, including a samurai sword, 2 Zulu short spears, and a broadsword said to have belonged to the King of Leicester. I did not know this all at the time, obviously. The first I saw them was when one of the grannies upstairs started handing them out to us. 1 minute it was Lord of the Dance, the next it was Lord of the Rings. I had never held a spear before, but there is a first time for everything in life, I guess. And the gang of attackers had absolutely rampaged through the home by the time we formed that final line of defense on the stairs. There were unconscious and severely injured people lying all over the kitchen, including one of our security team. But the gang wanted more yet. When they got to the stairs and saw what they were up against, they very understandably hesitated. I remember gripping the short spear called an assegai and telling some balaclava-wearing scumbag that if he tried coming up the stairs, I was going to skewer him like a fricking kebab. He looked just as shocked as I was to see a bloody Zulu short spear being pointed in his face. But that shock and awe worked majorly to our advantage, and no one fancied a piece of it. There is this standoff on the stairs, with everyone screaming at each other. Then the next thing I know, the women and kids upstairs with us started throwing things down from the floor above at the gang of masked attackers. I'm talking stiletto heels, little marble statuettes, big glass ashtrays, anything heavy or jagged enough to do some damage started raining down onto the attackers below. I remember seeing this one big ashtray land on this fellow's head, and he actually collapsed to the ground, even started shaking and twitching. His pals started screaming, trying to wake him up, and then trying to drag him out towards the back garden. But those missiles kept coming. I suppose that is what saved us in the end. Having us forming that line of defense was one thing, but we were still outnumbered and outgunned, so to speak. One swing of that sledgehammer would have smashed my spear. I know the gang could have taken us if they wanted to, not without a couple of serious injuries, but they would have been able to do it if they really, really wanted to. But it was those screaming harpies above and beside us that won the day. By the time the gang retreated to the back garden again, the home's hallway was just a mess of blood, broken glass, marble dust, and broken shoes. The gang had also started to smash things on their way out, probably as a final FU to the Fitzes. But that was nothing compared to the damage they had done to the men of the family. Like I said before, we might have done a job in protecting the more vulnerable members of the family, but those that had tried to fight back had been subjected to what I can only describe as a bloodbath. There were broken legs, broken arms, broken ribs, and fractured skulls. People's teeth were smashed. Their fingers were literally hanging off in places, and one guy's eye had popped out of the socket following a really severe skull fracture. We had to keep all the kids upstairs while the EMTs carried everyone outside. We could hide their eyes from the injuries, but trying to ensure they did not hear the screams was basically impossible. They only died down when the small army of paramedics started pumping painkillers into the victims. But even then, what were screams became these terrible groans and moans as the wounded were fed to waiting ambulances. The police had been there for a while by the time the wounded were all taken to hospital, and I had expected everyone to give them the cold shoulder. But even though some of these people had been involved in criminality all their lives, and their whole motto was basically criminals use the police as a weapon like any other, not just to punish their enemies, but to identify them in cases where they have concealed their faces during an attack. But why attack a funeral like that? And who in their right mind would target a funeral of all things? As far as I know, the answer is a pretty simple one. The attackers were a rival criminal family. The Fitzes had rubbed the wrong way one too many times. And the why is even simpler. Because they could. Our colleague that was wounded during the melee ended up needing about 30 stitches to put his head and face back together, and he never returned to work after that. I also heard something about the guy who was knocked unconscious with that big glass ashtray. He did not report to the hospital straight away. He could not, but that meant the brain injury he had received got worse and worse, until finally he showed up at A&E begging for help because he kept having seizures. Apparently the doctors asked him how he hurt his head, but then instead of just making something up, he goes to tell them exactly what had happened. He says he and his pals raided the Fitz's property where he had gotten a bonk on the head, and he did not remember anything else. The doctors start doing brain scans, trying to work out the damage. Then once they were done, the cops showed up and arrested him. His gang got him a lawyer who instructed him not to say another word regarding who was present at the raid. Then in the end, this poor guy was the only one to go down for what had happened. And all because that brain injury meant that he could not think properly anymore. His fellow gang members let it happen too, because he was no use to them out in the streets anymore. And he had two choices: keep his mouth shut and do his time, or they would have him killed in prison to keep him quiet for good. That was not strictly the end of the whole affair either. And after about 6 months of calm, some of these rival gangsters started turning up dead all over Dublin. Not all of them, mind you, just the ones that the Fitzes were sure had raided their house on the day of that funeral. And not long after, the bodies started turning up. I handed in my notice. I came to realize that some security firms, at least in Ireland, were Siamese twins with some of the country's crime families. I asked my boss if that was the end of us working with families like the Fitzes, and he gave me an honest answer when he told me, no, we worked for whoever pays, and that was that. It is just that in our case, the people willing to pay the big bucks for security tended to need it for all the wrong reasons. I ended up signing on to a different firm later on, one that dealt almost exclusively in providing security guards to the likes of HMV and Tesco. The pay was not as good, obviously, but it was a much quieter life, and I got to focus on my boxing much more too. Although my career never took off in the way that I had hoped, that did not bother me much though, because I got to settle down, live a quiet, peaceful life, and start a family, all without having to worry about masked thugs attacking me and mine when we were at our weakest.